that Josh got arrested for heroin yesterday?
You're kidding. I don't even know a lot about it. I just know that I would never do it. I don't even know how people use it.
Most people inject it into their bloodstream.
Ugh, I hate needles. I can't believe one of our friends are into that.
Yeah, it's really illegal in the U.S. It's a Schedule 1 narcotic.
Oh, okay. Why is that?
A lot of Americans have a really negative view on the drug, and rightfully so. It's highly addictive and easily abused. But when you investigate the history of heroin, you begin to see that it's a lot more complex than just junkies and needles.
Heroin is highly addictive and can affect the body in many ways. When heroin is used, it is turned into morphine and attaches to the opioid receptors. This then creates the rush that people experience.
By exerting powerful pain relief to the rest of the body. Chemicals flood the system and latch onto millions of opiate receptors peppered throughout the body.
When an individual starts to use heroin, short-term effects on the body start to take place. It can cause the body to feel drowsy and even result in nausea and vomiting. It can slow your heart rate, which also decreases breathing. This can also be accompanied by dry skin and severe itching.
Addiction becomes an even bigger problem because opiates also slow down breathing and heart rate. Mix them with other things that slow down your body, and everything could grind to a halt.
As the addiction increases, the long-term effects start to attack the body. This can result in collapsed veins, hepatitis B, an HIV infection, and even deterioration of the brain.
According to a study published in the Journal of Neuroscience, frequent heroin injections actually desensitizes these receptors. They get so stimulated they kind of wear themselves out. So over time, a user will have to increase their dosage just to get the same feeling. But there's no doubt that heroin is dangerous. It's a drug especially prone to deadly overuse because its hits can vary in purity. Someone who is used to using 10% pure heroin mixed with some other stuff might purchase some that's 60% pure heroin, but there's no good way to tell the difference.
Symptoms of withdrawal will also take place, such as muscle pain and insomnia. Bacterial infections of the heart lining can also occur. In the end, it can cause severe illness and even death.
Heroin is an interesting drug to come by. People might wonder how it has made its way over into America. Turns out that the Chinese Americans had immigrated from China to San Francisco in the year of 1849 and had brought heroin along with them. The start of smoking heroin had a lot of racial and social anxieties that came along with the narcotic itself. It had affected people in mainly 3 different ways. First, reproduction had an impact from heroin due to the fact that people would become carefree and do whatever they pleased. Second, prostitution had grown to become a problem within the United States because heroin would affect people's feelings physically and emotionally. And lastly, racial purity had grown to become a problem in the United States because Chinese Americans had brought heroin into the country and others weren't very pleased with the way that heroin was beginning to change society. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 would prevent the Chinese from immigrating into the U.S., which would limit the amount of heroin coming to the land. In 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which also contributed to the limitation in the U.S. Later on, in 1909, the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act outlawed the importation and possession of heroin. Finally, the Heroin Act of 1924 would make all heroin illegal, even if it were for medical purposes.
Starting in November of 1955, over 8 million GIs were sent overseas when the United States went to war with Vietnam. Faced with the stresses and pressures of the war at hand, the soldiers needed to find an escape.
When I used to shoot dope, I didn't have fear. That was the whole thing about it. To keep myself going through the day in combat, I would get high. I would be under the influence of some type of drugs, and I wouldn't feel fear. But after coming down from the drugs, I would start feeling fear, and that's when I would go back to getting high again.
The GIs quickly found that heroin was easy to come by in Vietnam and provided the exact relief that they had been looking for. Upon returning home, approximately 15% of all American soldiers fighting in Vietnam were suffering from a heroin addiction. At the time, the United States military claimed that that number was less than 2%. Vietnam War veterans had it rough when they came back from the war, and the United States mass hysteria against heroin only made it worse. The primary care and treatment provided for veteran addicts was what is known as a methadone clinic.
So methadone clinics are clinics where you go in, and instead of taking an opiate, would you begin to come in and take methadone on a daily basis, which is just basically a synthetic opiate.
Because methadone is a synthetic opiate, the GIs found that their addictions were not cured, just transferred from one drug to another. The use of heroin by soldiers in the Vietnam War did no more than cause mass hysteria and widespread hatred over the drug on U.S. soil. The addicted soldiers came home to little help and no hope to kick their addictions.
During the 80s and 90s, people were becoming more affected by AIDS. This was known as the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s. In the beginning of the epidemic, people started to become more aware that sharing needles from drug injection was a critical element in HIV transmissions. The use of the drug depended on the social problems happening in New York City that were mostly affected by AIDS. Activist groups like ACT UP wanted to put an end to this epidemic.
ACT UP gave you a sense of empowerment. It made you feel like you were actually doing something about it rather than just being a victim.
Their goal was to call a worldwide attention to the public health crisis and to put an end to this epidemic. Solutions that ACT UP offered was a needle exchange done by activist groups in New York City. This was a major factor that helped stop the spread of AIDS because drug users were using clean needles instead of reusing or sharing others.
People with HIV/AIDS are those believed to be at risk to be quarantined. These at-risk people were IV drug users, prostitutes, and homosexuals.
Heroin is effectively grown in 4 areas of the world: the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia, Latin America, Afghanistan, and Mexico. Heroin is easily smuggled into the United States because of the high cost per volume. The Mexican state of Guerrero is a hotbed for opium production. Clashes between clans and drug cartels have paralyzed the majority of the state.
The things that we're watching, obviously, is Sinaloa because they're very powerful and widespread. At this point, we really don't see any indication of them losing traction in a big way.
Meanwhile, in America, law enforcement officials and experts believe cartels becoming violent is not a concern. The concern in America is the drugs itself. America knows that they are not here to cause havoc. They know it is bad for business and that they have to be well behaved.
Heroin has played a major role in the 2016 presidential election. 2 weeks ago, New Hampshire hosted the first primaries. The ongoing heroin overdose crisis in this state makes it a top priority for the citizens living here. New Hampshire had over 400 overdose-related deaths last year alone.
In that very first conversation, the issue of heroin and the epidemic it represented here in New Hampshire was raised with me. I have to confess I was surprised.
You talk about New Hampshire for a moment. One of the stories that has not been as reported nationally is the fact that many of the people who today that are dependent on heroin are because they became dependent on prescription opiates.
Drug addicts are usually charged with possession. Possessing illegal drugs may be charged as a misdemeanor or a felony. The charge usually depends on the type of drug involved. In some states with strict drug laws, even very small amounts of drugs can be charged as a felony. all of the presidential candidates have been focusing on demonstrating that addiction is a mental problem and should be solved with treatment instead of incarceration.
We need to understand that addiction is a disease, not a criminal activity.
Political will to do it, and as president, I will secure the border. We will end this deluge of drugs that is flowing over our southern border and that is killing Americans.
In 1990, Trump argued that drug enforcement was a joke and all drugs should be legalized in order to take the profit away from the drug cartels. Now, he believes the current drug laws need to be maintained. Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign announced a $10 billion plan to combat America's deadly epidemic of drug and alcohol addiction. The plan would focus on treatment and recovery programs. Bernie Sanders would most likely change the current U.S. drug laws. He believes the war on drugs is a failed policy that has served to increase unemployment, imprison nonviolent offenders, and unfairly target minorities.
I'm really surprised by the history of heroin. No wonder there's such a stigma against it.
It's really interesting that this topic has made it all the way to our upcoming elections. I wonder if it will sway voting at all.
I wonder how heroin addiction would be affected if we stopped treating users as criminals. If the U.S. offered addicts help, there might not be such an epidemic going on right now. I think it might be time for us to change our opinions over heroin.
That's a good point. I agree with you, and I think you might be right. What do you think?